Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
Good evening, I'm David Kramer here with Alaska Weather. As always, please visit our website at weather.gov/Alaska. You can get any updates to our forecast or check out any watches, warnings, or advisories that we have out for the state. You can also call our weather info line at 1-800-472-0391. Get any updates to the forecast through that means as well, especially for your individual area if you're curious about any of the watches, warnings, or advisories out for your spot. Taking a look now, we'll take a look at some of the watches, warnings, advisories that we have out. Starting off in the Panhandle area, we have several watches all for the northern parts of the Panhandle, and those are all winter weather watches for snow, taking effect late Thursday night through Friday night, expecting snowfall anywhere from 4 to 9 inches in those locations. Again, that is a winter storm watch for much of the northern part of the Panhandle. Taking a look further to the north, we have several watches and warnings out for much of the interior part of the state, including the west coast and up further to the north. We'll start off on the west as we'll watch this progress through time. We do have a frontal system coming in from the west, moving further to the east. So we'll see times out for all the west coast events. That's going to start or in effect now and going to last into tomorrow sometime around noon on Thursday. Now up further to the north, we do have the winter storm warnings up here. Those are for snow and blowing snow with the stronger winds in these locations. But as we get further to the south, a little bit warmer there and less wind. So we are seeing some snow and the potential for light freezing rain in the Yukon Delta area. Again, those are all in effect now and going to last around noontime on Thursday. As we move further to the east, still going to see a lot of snow. So all of the yellow ones here are winter weather advisories, and those are for snow. 4 to 7 inches for most locations, and those are going to start to progress further in time as well. So starting on Thursday and then lasting into Friday, especially as we get to the more eastern locations, could last into Friday around noontime as well. Going to start sometime on Thursday morning for these far eastern locations. Up along the Brooks Range, going to see those winter storm warnings continuing as we get further to the east. Going to expect that to last into early parts of Friday as well, and we are going to see some snow and blowing snow in those locations throughout the Brooks Range. Taking a look now at our satellite imagery, we can see here starting along the west coast, what is causing all of these problems is a frontal system that extends down through much of the eastern Bering Sea over parts of the west coast as well. And we can watch this system slowly pushing to the east, bringing a lot of wind with it up along those more northern locations. Behind this system, we have an area of high pressure out over much of the Bering Sea, some of the Aleutian Islands, in between the frontal system that we saw along the west coast and further off to the west, a new system trying to come in from the west. As we look out further to the east, we have some high pressure out over parts of Canada extending in, holding off some of the frontal system, but bringing in a lot of clear skies to areas of the northern part of the Gulf and some of the southeastern parts of mainland Alaska. Then finally, we have a low south of the Alaska Panhandle that's bringing in just some cloud cover to the area, not a lot of precip, but much of the Panhandle is still pretty clear, all things considered, for what we have with high pressure from the north. So we'll take a look for weather for the remainder of the day. High pressure keeping a lot of the precipitation at bay for the Panhandle and southeastern parts of mainland Alaska. But we have our main frontal system coming in on the west coast, bringing a lot of snow out ahead of this for much of the western part of the interior, all the west coast up towards the Arctic coastline with some areas of blowing snow along the Arctic coastline. Then as we have some warmer air further to the south, we are seeing some rain for the Alaska Peninsula and down through the eastern Aleutian Islands with high pressure out to the west, just some areas of lighter rain further to the north of that high pressure out in the western Bering Sea. As we move into the tonight time frame, going to continue to have that high pressure out there. A new low forming coming in on the northern parts of the Bering Sea, bringing in some rain with that a little bit warmer with the effects of that high bringing in much warmer air to those locations. Bringing in some of that rain just along the western coast. And we have some snow out ahead of that all the way along the west coast of the state. We have some snow up there And then our old front now being a big trough throughout much of the interior part of the state, bringing in a lot of snow, especially ahead of that, as we have some of those warnings and advisories kicking up later tonight, early Thursday morning time frame. Some of that snow going to make it to south central Alaska, and then warmer to the south. We are going to see some rain for Kodiak Island. High pressure is still enough of a dominating factor over the Panhandle to continue to be void of precipitation through the night. Then on Thursday, high pressure still keeping it out, but starting to see some of that pushing closer towards the area with all this snow coming in from mainland Alaska further towards the east, starting to get to the Yakutat area. Further to the south, warmer in the Gulf, going to see a new low form up there, bringing in some rain to those areas. Snow continuing through much of the interior, western parts of the interior as well, and west coast, with some blowing snow along the Arctic coastline continuing through Thursday. Some of these, they're going to start to get a lot lighter in Thursday afternoon. As we get down to the southern locations, southwest Alaska, going to see some snow with some rain along the Alaska Peninsula, and our new system coming in far out to the west towards the western Aleutian Islands. On Friday, we can see that system moving more into the Bering Sea towards the Pribilof Islands, bringing some rain out there and to the central and western Aleutians. Mainland Alaska going to continue to see some lighter snow continuing throughout the day on Friday, but main activity is going to be out in the Panhandle area, where we are going to see more snowfall happening in those northern locations, expecting that late Thursday night through Friday night. We do have those winter weather or winter storm watch out for snow for those locations in the northern part of the Panhandle. For our temps, for lows tonight into Thursday morning, teens and 20s for the Panhandle area. A lot of single digits in much of interior part of the state. Colder as we get off to the east, below zero there. Up into the single digits to teens along the Arctic coastline. Warmer west coast of the state, getting up to down to as low as around 30 degrees along the coastline. Colder as we get further inland. And for the Alaska Peninsula, mid-30s to right around 40 throughout the Aleutian Islands and for the Pribilof Islands. Highs for Thursday afternoon going to get up to around 40 degrees for the Aleutian Islands, Alaska Peninsula, just above freezing for much of southwest Alaska, going to stay below freezing in the teens and 20s along the Arctic coastline. Single digits for much of the eastern part of the interior, central interior primarily in the teens, 20s for south central Alaska, and as we get into the Panhandle area, primarily in the mid-20s there. As we look at our lows for Friday morning or Thursday night, we do have in the 20s to right around 30 degrees for much of the Panhandle area. Teens to mid-20s for the south central area, getting into the single digits or below zero for much of the interior, especially as we get to the upper Yukon Valley area, down to -11 there. Single digits to low teens for areas along the Arctic coastline, west coast of the state, Seward Peninsula, mid-20s, then staying below freezing for much of southwest Alaska, but right around 40 degrees for the Aleutian Islands and Alaska Peninsula, including the Pribilof Islands. Highs for Friday afternoon, we do have 40s for most of the Aleutian Islands, Alaska Peninsula, right around freezing for much of southwest Alaska, mid-20s for the Seward Peninsula, single digits for much of mainland Alaska, up into the 20s for areas around south central Alaska, and right around freezing for the Panhandle.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Starting off our aviation section, we will take a quick look at the flying weather charts. We have our main system pushing through the main part of the state, bringing IFR conditions through much of central mainland Alaska out towards the upper Yukon Valley as well, and extending up the Arctic coastline, especially those western areas of the Arctic coastline. Down much of the west coast is MVFR conditions, then out over the Bering Sea, a lot of MVFR conditions as well, with an area of IFR conditions from St. Lawrence Island down towards the Pribilof Islands. As we move into Thursday afternoon, we will see that expansion of those IFR conditions as our system pushes further across the state. We do have IFR conditions all throughout the eastern part of the mainland Alaska, out through the western portions of the state as well, and then up the west coast. Now those IFR conditions, MVFR conditions along much of the Arctic coastline. And then we do have some MVFR conditions out through much of the southern Bering Sea, Aleutian Islands, and Alaska Peninsula, with an area of IFR coming in from the west out over the western Aleutian Islands. Meanwhile, the Panhandle is going to stay VFR conditions for much of Thursday. As we move into Friday morning, we will have a low developing out in the Gulf that is going to bring some MVFR and IFR conditions to the Panhandle area, but a lot of the lower ceilings and visibilities are going to start clearing out on Friday. We do have an area extending out from central parts of the panhandle, or from the interior part of the state down through the Alaska Range, and then some MVFR conditions continuing along the Alaska Peninsula. MVFR conditions remaining along much of the west coast, but a lot of those conditions improving as that system pushes off further to the east. Then our next system coming in from the west, bringing a lot of IFR conditions for the central and western Aleutian Islands, extending up into much of the Bering Sea as well, including the Pribilof Islands. Then on Friday afternoon, that area is going to expand even further to the north and east, still including the Pribilof Islands, now for the eastern Aleutians, all the way through areas of the western Aleutian Islands. Throughout much of mainland Alaska, clearing out even more. However, we are keeping some MVFR and IFR conditions for the Alaska Range, extending all the way to the eastern part of the state. And then with our low in the Gulf, we will see some IFR and MVFR conditions for the Panhandle. Taking a look now at our passes, as expected, and AKwx should be IFR throughout the day tomorrow. Adigan Pass as well. Then Lake Clark and Mel, both IFR on Thursday, as well as Rainy Pass and Windy Pass. However, Isabel Pass will start off VFR and then drop down to IFR as that system pushes easterly through the state. That will also be true of Mentasta Pass, starting off VFR, dropping down to IFR in the afternoon. Tenedo Pass also starting off VFR, dropping down to IFR, as well as Portage. Over Fort Chilkoot and White should remain VFR throughout the day on Thursday. Then we'll take a look at our freezing levels. Surface freezing level riding right along the Gulf coastline with some warmer air. Head up there towards Kodiak Island. Then our surface freezing level riding up the west coast of the state out towards the Seward Peninsula and then out to the west. And then some areas of warmer air throughout much of the Bering Sea with high pressure out over the area. As we look at our icing for Thursday, we have an area in the central Bering Sea extending out between 3,000 and 7,000 feet near the Pribilof Islands. But for mainland Alaska, we have much of our icing out over the southwestern part of the state below 5,000 feet. Our main core of icing below 6,000 feet for central parts and eastern parts of the interior, below 3,000 feet as we get up along the Arctic coastline, and then between 2,000 and 7,000 feet along the North Gulf Coast. Panhandle should be clear, but then some areas of icing off to the east. Taking a look now at our jet stream, we do have one portion of the jet, 90 to 100 knots, coming down just to the east of the state out of a northerly direction. Weak branch of the jet coming in around 60 knots out of a westerly direction, coming across the central part of the state. And then we have our flow around our high pressure that is moving at 145 knots, dropping down to 130 out over the northern parts of the Bering Sea. And as it heads down south over the Alaska Peninsula and near the eastern Aleutian Islands, down to 105 knots there out of a northerly direction. Taking us to our 9,000-foot winds, we do have westerly flow over much of the Bering Sea, becoming more northerly as we move around that high pressure. Highest area around 90 knots near St. Matthew Island, down to 65 to 55 knots out over the Alaska Peninsula. Westerly flow anywhere from 10 to 30 knots, strongest to the south over mainland Alaska. The northwesterly flow around 30 knots over the Panhandle. Then for 3,000 feet, westerly flow over much of mainland Alaska, 15 to 35 knots, and stronger as we get to the southern portions of the state, 45 knots there. 10 knots out over the Panhandle. Westerly flow out over the Gulf, 35 knots, dropping down to around 25 as we get near the Aleutian Islands, 50 knots near the eastern Aleutian Islands, Alaska Peninsula. Turbulence should be mostly around the southwestern part of the state, below 4,000 and 5,000 feet there, with areas out by the western Aleutians as well.
At the Geophysical Institute, scientists monitor earthquake data from several hundred seismic sensing stations across Alaska. When a seismic disturbance occurs, this data is instantly transmitted to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's West Coast and Alaska Tsunami Warning Center in Palmer, Alaska. Scientists on 24-hour call quickly analyze that data, along with data from their own network of sensors, and decide whether or not they should issue a tsunami warning.
When we see a large earthquake has occurred and it's occurred near the coast, we'll issue a warning to those who could be affected by the wave within a certain amount of time. And then we'll monitor the wave to see if it really was dangerous or not, and if it was dangerous, then we'll expand the warning to all the people that it may be dangerous for.
You can improve warning systems. You can do that a number of ways. One of the most obvious is by providing better hardware to measure earthquakes more accurately, but also to measure directly the tsunami itself.
As part of the DART project, Deep Ocean Assessment and Reporting of Tsunamis, NOAA has developed a system of 6 ocean buoys which help measure a potential tsunami. Attached to the buoys are pressure sensors on the ocean bottom that can detect tsunamis passing overhead. The sensors instantly beam the data via satellite to NOAA's tsunami warning centers in Palmer and Ewa Beach, Hawaii.
I work with the state seismologists and other seismologists in our Alaska Earthquake Information Center to generate the hypothetical earthquake scenarios.
These what-if scenarios are used to produce very practical products. One of them is called an inundation map.
Inundation maps are critical to defining evacuation zones and routes so that coastal communities can respond quickly in the event of a tsunami. These deceptively simple maps show the highest point of flooding by a potential tsunami, but a mind-numbing amount of data is needed to generate them. It is only with the advent of the supercomputer that researchers finally had the tool they needed to take tsunami research to the next level. In the mid-1990s, Alaska Sea Grant funded a research project by University of Alaska Fairbanks scientists Zygmunt Kowalik and Elena Suleimani. They worked with the Arctic Region Supercomputing Center at UAF to create a model of an event that occurred over 120 years ago.
The first effort to test a tsunami model was to model the 1883 wave that was generated by the eruption of St. Augustine volcano, that is an island volcano in Cook Inlet.
When the volcano erupted, part of the mountain crashed into the sea and generated a wave that raced across Cook Inlet and partially flooded the village of English Bay. A logbook kept by the Alaska Commercial Company trading post at English Bay documents the sudden inundation.
On this morning at 8:15 o'clock, 4 tidal waves flowed with a westerly current, one following the other at the rate of 30 miles per hour, the sea rising 20 feet above the usual level.
Kowalik and Suleimani's analysis of that event resulted in a computer model that has been refined and is now used to create inundation maps for Alaska coastal towns. This supercomputer animation shows how several tsunamis inundated the U.S. Navy base in Kodiak after the 1964 earthquake. The red area indicates maximum inundation. Projections like this are used to create inundation maps.
The goal of our work in inundation mapping is to make coastal Alaska a safer place to live. And I think our major goal is to save lives.
Some shrewd detective work helped the researchers refine their computer model. Geologist and tsunami expert Dr. Gary Carver collected geological clues and considered eyewitness accounts to work up an accurate picture of what actually happened when the tsunamis hit Kodiak in 1964.
In this area, the wave came up this bay, and we have here some of the very best information concerning how large the 1964 wave was. This is also an area where we modeled the wave as a way of calibrating the modeling exercise. And what we found is that in this particular case, the modeled wave departed somewhat from what we know to be the actual area that the wave covered. But in reality, we know from the sand deposits and from the eyewitness accounts that the wave ran back into the trees, into the vicinity of those many houses and buildings back there. And so here's a place where we were able to use the geologic evidence and the historic evidence to calibrate the model.
If we get a big tsunami in this community, similar to what the University of Alaska Fairbanks researchers have told us, this waterfront will be gone. Our goal is to protect community residents and do the best we can to protect infrastructure. And by knowing where the wave may come, based on the information from the scientists, we've got a much better chance of preparing the community for dealing with that. But we've also tried to really educate the community that there are some instances that could cause a tsunami, and the sirens may not go off because we may not have gotten word that from the Tsunami Warning Center in Palmer that in fact a tsunami is on its way, and that would be one that would be locally generated by a local earthquake. And what we tell people is if they have trouble standing up for 15 seconds or the earthquake lasts for longer than 30 seconds, they should evacuate. They shouldn't wait for the siren to go off.
To help people in towns like Kodiak understand the threat and prepare for the next tsunamis, the NOAA National Weather Service runs an information program in partnership with the Alaska Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Management called the Tsunami Ready Program.
Seward, Alaska was designated as the first tsunami-ready community within the state. The Alaska Division of Emergency Services and the city government got together via the fire chief and the assistant city manager and worked to bring us into uniform plan for evacuation and informational distribution to all of the citizens within the area.
This is a test of the emergency siren system.
This is only a test.
It means that we can get the word out to the people. We have all of the warning systems in place. We receive the information and we can pass that on to the people in town and be able to get them into an area of safety in case of tsunamis.
For the sourdough Alaskans who survived the ocean's fury in 1964, a real-life nightmare is burned into their memories. They know what tsunamis can do. But most of us were not here back then, when the black waves of March tore into our shores and swept away more than 100 souls. We would do well to learn from the experience of our fellow Alaskans. Because as the scientists assure us, it is not a question of if, but when the next tsunami will strike our coastline.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Good evening and welcome back for the marine forecast. We'll take a look now at the southeastern part of the state. We have northerly flow 25 to 30 knots in the northern parts of the inside waters, with gusts as high as 40 knots as we get to the more central parts of the inland waters. And then we have, as we get further south, northeasterly flow around 15 knots there. Northerly flow 20 knots in the southern parts of the eastern Gulf, and then as we get to the more northern locations, 15 to 20 knots out of a more southerly direction. Then on Friday, wind's going to pick up here, southerly to easterly flow around 35 knots with gusts as high as 50 knots. And then as we move to the more southern parts of the eastern Gulf, southerly flow 20 to 25 knots there. Inside water still a little bit higher, northerly flow primarily 35 to 40 knots. The more northern locations becoming southeasterly as we get further to the south. For the south central area, starting off in the more eastern locations of the northern part of the Gulf, including Prince William Sound, northerly flow around 15 knots there. As we get further to the south, we have northwesterly flow 20 knots, getting higher through the Barren Islands, 35 to 40 knots, and then diminishing as we get into Cook Inlet, northern parts of Cook Inlet, only around 10 knots. Then on Friday, northwesterly flow continuing through the Barrens area, including some freezing spray for our areas west of the Barren Islands towards Kamishak Bay, around 45 knots there, and then northerly flow 10 to 15 for Cook Inlet. As you look in the northern locations of the northern part of the Gulf, northerly flow 25 to 30 knots, including Prince William Sound, seeing northerly flow at 25 knots there. As you move to the Alaska Peninsula area, primarily northwesterly flow, 30 to 35 knots, strongest around the Alaska Peninsula and south of Kodiak Island. We're going to see some stronger gusts on the southern side of the Alaska Peninsula as well. As we move into Friday, continuing to see the northwesterly flow, 30 to 45 knots, strongest on the southern side of the Alaska Peninsula, 35 to 40 knots around Kodiak Island, with seas as high as 16 feet. For Thursday, around the Aleutian Islands, westerly flow 15 to 25 knots. As we get closer towards the eastern Aleutian Islands, northwesterly flow around 30 knots there. As we get out by the western Aleutians, southerly flow 25 to 30 knots. Then on Friday, southerly flow continuing by the western Aleutian Islands around 30 knots with 15 feet for seas. As we move to the central and eastern Aleutian Islands, primarily a southwest to west flow, 20 to 30 knots, strongest by the northern part of the central Aleutian Islands. As we move into Thursday, along the west coast of the state, primarily a northwesterly flow. As we see, we have 30 knots as we get further to the north, but as high as 45 knots by Nunavik Island and St. Matthew Island. And as we move into Friday, even though a lot of our speeds are going to be low, around 25 to 30 knots, as we get around St. Lawrence Island, we are going to see winds strong enough and temperatures cold enough for some freezing spray up there, 20 to 25 knots on Friday. For Thursday, in any of the ice-free areas, we are going to see freezing spray up along the Arctic coastline, easterly flow around 25 knots there, becoming more northwesterly to west as we get by the Bering Strait area, 25 to 40 knots there. Then on Friday, all flow going to be primarily north or northeasterly, 15 to 20 knots along the Arctic coastline, getting as high as 25 knots along the west coast. Again, ice-free waters are going to see freezing spray. Quick recap for the state. We have our main weather maker moving through central part of the state, an old front that is now troughed out, going to bring a lot of snow to locations. Along the west coast where that front currently is, we do have some winter weather advisories and winter storm warnings for blowing snow and heavy snow up along the Arctic coastline for those winter storm warnings. More in terms of snow, 4 to 7 inches as we get further to the south along the west coast, including much of the interior out until Thursday afternoon along the west coast, but staying out until Friday as we get further to the east, starting a little bit later there. With Alaska Weather, I'm David Kramer. Thanks for being with us.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.